The worn-out sign above the door simply read, Quartermaster Repairs, 3rd Shift, but everyone on Fort Morrison knew it as Margaret's place. For 23 years, Specialist Margaret Rhodes had sat in this same chair, under this same flickering fluorescent light, mending the United States Army one torn sleeve at a time. Her hands, though gnarled with age and arthritis, moved with the precision of a concert pianist as she guided fabric under the heavy foot of the industrial sewing machine. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the needle was the only sound that ever seemed to exist in her world. At 61, Margaret was the oldest enlisted soldier on the base, a quiet anomaly in a sea of young, energetic privates and sergeants. She had joined the Army late, at 38, after her husband had passed and her children had grown. With no other skills and a desperate need for purpose, she had enlisted, hoping to use the one talent her mother had taught her on a porch in rural Alabama, sewing. The Army, surprisingly, had taken her. They always needed uniforms mended, patches sewn on straight, and dress blues tailored. They didn't care that she was a woman, or that she was older, or that she rarely spoke. They cared that her stitches never broke. She worked in the dead of night, the 3rd to 7 a.m. shift, when the base was quiet and she could be alone with her thoughts. Young soldiers would drop off their torn combat uniforms in a wire basket by the door, and Margaret would fix them, leaving them in a neat pile on a shelf for the morning shift to distribute. She never knew their names, and they never knew hers. To them, she was just the ghost of the repair shop. I'm the silent lady who made their gear right again. On a particularly cold Tuesday in November, a young private first class named Miller had brought in a uniform that was practically in ribbons. He had caught it on a piece of razor wire during a training exercise. His face was flushed with embarrassment and exhaustion. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he had stammered, his voice cracking. "It's my only set. The supply sergeant is going to have my head." Margaret had simply looked at the uniform, then back at the boy. He couldn't have been older than 19. She saw the fear in his eyes, not of the sergeant, but of failure. She gave him a single, slow nod. "It'll be ready before your morning run." He had left, looking relieved but skeptical. That night, she worked on Private Miller's uniform with extra care. It wasn't just a tear, it was a jagged, complex gash that required a special kind of stitch to reinforce the surrounding fabric. She spent 2 hours on it, carefully matching the thread, reinforcing the patch from the inside so it would hold under any stress. As she worked, she thought about her own son, who lived in a different state and rarely called. She imagined someone far away mending his clothes with the same tenderness, and it gave her a small measure of comfort. But the uniform that would change everything came in just before dawn at 5:30 a.m. It was carried by a young nervous aide who placed it carefully in the basket, almost as if it were made of glass. It wasn't torn in a dramatic way. There were no gaping holes or shredded fabric. The damage was subtle, but for the soldier who wore it, it would be devastating. It was a Class A dress uniform, with the dark green jacket worn for formal parades and ceremonies. It was immaculate, save for one thing. On the left shoulder, where the combat patch should have been, the stitching had come loose. The patch, a small embroidered emblem signifying service in a specific division during a specific war, was hanging by a single frayed thread. To any casual observer, it would have looked fine. But to the soldier who wore it, it was a badge of honor on the verge of being lost. There was a sticky note attached. In hurried, precise handwriting, it read, "General Corrigan, urgent, needed for 900 ceremony, repair, and press." Margaret's hands, which had been steady for 23 years, trembled slightly. She had never met a general. She had never even seen one up close. They existed in a different world, one of strategy and command, far removed from her silent room of needles and thread. She turned the jacket over in her hands. The fabric was of a higher quality than the standard issue, a finer wool that felt soft and expensive. She ran her finger over the loose patch. It was a simple square, a deep blue with a golden griffin in the center. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was important. This wasn't just a uniform, it was a man's history. Carefully, she laid the jacket flat on her work table. She snipped the last, dangling thread with her small silver scissors. The patch came free in her hand. She held it up to the light, looking at the tiny, perfect stitches on its border. Then she set to work. She chose a spool of the finest gold thread she had, not the standard olive drab, but a color that would disappear into the patch's border, an invisible and strong. She threaded the needle on her first try, a small miracle these days. She positioned the patch exactly where the faint impression of the old stitching remained, a ghostly outline of its proper place. She pinned it, checked the alignment from 3 different angles, and then she began. The thump, thump, thump of the machine was slower now, more deliberate. Margaret guided the fabric, her eyes squinting behind her thick glasses, her foot barely pressing the pedal. She didn't just sew the patch on, she married it to the jacket. Each stitch was a promise, a guarantee that this piece of a man's soul would never fall away. She reinforced the corners, a trick her mother had taught her for patches on work clothes. She tied off the threads on the inside, not with a simple knot, but with a complex series of tiny loops that would never unravel. She worked for 45 minutes, a task that would have taken a younger soldier 10. But Margaret wasn't just fixing a uniform. She was honoring a service she could only imagine. When she was finished, she held the jacket up. The patch was perfect. It looked as if it had grown there, as if it were an inseparable part of the garment. She used a soft, damp cloth to wipe a single smudge of dust from the shoulder. Then she reached for the steam iron. She pressed the entire jacket, not just the shoulder, paying special attention to the creases in the sleeves and the collar. She polished the brass buttons with a soft cloth until they gleamed like gold mirrors. She didn't have to do any of this. Her job was just to sew the patch. But for her, it was unthinkable to send a soldier out into the world in anything less than his best. At 7 a.m., as the first light of dawn began to creep through the high, dusty windows of her shop, she hung the general's jacket on a special padded hanger. She placed it on the shelf designated for command staff, a shelf that was almost always empty. She looked at it one last time, a small, perfect thing in a room full of hard use and quiet labor. Then she gathered her things, pulled on her worn coat, and walked home to her small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the base, just as she had done every morning for 23 years. She didn't think about the general. She thought about the bread she needed to buy and the finicky lock on her front door. The world of the base continued without her, a churning machine of which she was but a silent cog. The ceremony that morning was for the 7th Infantry Division, a formal award presentation in the base's main parade ground. General Marcus Corrigan, a man with a chest full of medals and a face carved from granite, stood at attention. He was a legend, a soldier's soldier who had led men in Desert Storm and the early years of the Iraq War. The combat patch on his shoulder, the one Margaret had so carefully reattached, signified his time with the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, a unit he had loved and left decades ago. As the band played and the colors were presented, General Corrigan felt a familiar, comforting weight on his shoulder. He didn't think about the patch. It was as much a part of him as his own skin. After the ceremony, he returned to his office, a sprawling space filled with flags, plaques, and photos of soldiers he had known and lost. He hung his jacket on the back of his chair, as he always did, and sat down to a mountain of paperwork. It was late in the afternoon when he reached for the jacket to retrieve a pen from the inside pocket. As he pulled it closer, his hand brushed against his left shoulder. He paused. He looked down. Something was different. The patch, the one that had been loose for weeks, the one he had been meaning to have fixed himself but had kept forgetting, was now perfectly secure. He ran his finger over its edge. The stitching was flawless, not just secure, but beautiful. He turned the jacket inside out, looking at the reverse side. The knotwork was intricate, delicate, and incredibly strong. It was the work of a master craftsperson. He stared at it for a long moment. This small piece of fabric, and this symbol of his past, had been treated with a reverence he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just a repair. It was a gift, a silent message from someone who understood that a uniform is more than just cloth. It's a repository of memory, of sacrifice, of identity. He called for his aide, the young man who had dropped the jacket off in the middle of the night. "This patch," the general said, his voice deep and resonant. "Who fixed it?" The aide shifted nervously. "Sir, the quartermaster repair shop, sir. The night shift." "Get me the name of the person who did this work," the general commanded. It took the aide the rest of the day to find out. The night shift was an anonymous entity. No one in the daytime offices knew much about the quiet woman who worked while they slept. But eventually, through pay records and shift logs, he found a name: Specialist Margaret Rhodes. The next morning at 6:45 a.m., General Corrigan walked through the doors of the quartermaster repair shop. He was in his standard combat fatigues, no medals, no fanfare. He was alone. The young private at the front desk nearly choked on his coffee. The general just nodded and asked where he could find the repair section. The private pointed a trembling finger towards the back, towards the room with the flickering light. The general walked down the narrow corridor. The sounds of the bass faded, replaced by the steady, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a sewing machine. He stopped at the open door. Inside, Margaret was working on a heavy-duty field jacket, her head bowed in concentration. She hadn't heard him approach over the noise of her machine. The general stood in the doorway, watching her. And he saw her gnarled hands, so gentle on the rough fabric. He saw the deep lines on her face, etched by years and loss and quiet perseverance. He saw the single, small American flag pin on her own, faded uniform blouse. He saw a woman completely absorbed in her duty, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, simply giving her all to a nameless soldier's coat. He knocked softly on the door frame. The thumping stopped. Margaret looked up, startled. She saw a tall, broad-shouldered man in fatigues. Her eyes, adjusted to the dim light, took a second to register the stars on his collar. When they did, her face went pale. She slowly stood up, her hands falling to her sides. "Specialist Rhodes?" the general asked. She could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. The general stepped into the room. He didn't say anything at first. And he walked over to her workbench and looked at the neat piles of mended uniforms, the spools of thread organized by color, the small dish of spare buttons. He then turned to her jacket, the one he had worn the day before, which his aide had brought back for him that morning. He wasn't wearing it. He had brought it with him, draped over his arm. He held it out to her. "I believe you worked on this." Margaret looked at the jacket, then back at the general. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "The patch was loose. I fixed it." "You didn't just fix it," the general said, his voice soft, stripped of all command. "You saved it." He turned the jacket around and pointed to the inside, to her intricate knots. "My mother used to tie knots like that," he said, a faraway look in his eyes. "She sewed all my patches when I was a boy, before I left for basic. She said a proper knot doesn't just hold the thread, it holds the story." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at her own work, suddenly shy. "My mama taught me that, sir," she managed to say.